My family, my wife, our two young children and I rented a beach house on the Outer Banks of North Carolina for a week one August. It was a beautiful, stilted house right on the sand, with a large wooden deck that had stairs leading directly down to the beach. For the first 2 days, it was paradise. The kids played in the surf, we grilled on the deck, and at night, the sound of the waves lulled us to sleep. On the third morning, I woke up before anyone else to watch the sunrise. I made a cup of coffee and went out onto the deck. The tide was low and the wet sand was a smooth, untouched canvas. Or it should have been. As the pale morning light grew, I saw a single line of footprints etched into the sand near the water's edge. My first thought was that another early riser had been out for a walk. But as I looked closer, a deep sense of unease began to creep over me. The prints didn't follow the coastline. They started at the ocean's edge as if someone had walked directly out of the water. They then proceeded in a dead straight line up the beach to our house. The trail didn't go up the stairs to the deck. Instead, it circled the thick wooden stilts that held our house up, making one complete loop. And then the trail led in another perfectly straight line right back to the water's edge and disappeared. I stood there, on the deck, my coffee growing cold in my hand, trying to make sense of it. Who would do that? And why? I went down to the beach to get a better look. The prints themselves were deeply unsettling. They were not from shoes, nor were they normal human footprints. They were long and narrow, with a deeply pronounced heel, and the toes, there seemed to be too many, at least 6 or 7, were long and splayed out, like a frog's. When my wife woke up, I showed them to her. She was just as creeped out as I was. We spent the day trying to rationalize it. A prankster, a strange local, but no explanation felt right. We watched the tide come in and wash the prints away, and we tried to put it out of our minds. The next morning, they were back. The exact same pattern. A single line of those bizarre, non-human footprints leading from the sea, circling our house and returning to the sea. It was a silent, daily visitation. A profound sense of being watched, of our temporary home being inspected by something unknown settled over our vacation. The kids were oblivious, but my wife and I were on edge, constantly scanning the horizon where the gray water met the gray sky. The last night of our stay was hot and still. A thick sea fog had rolled in, blanketing everything in a damp, silent shroud. We had put the kids to bed and were reading in the living room when we heard a sound from outside. It was a wet, shuffling, dragging sound coming from the deck right outside our sliding glass door. We froze, our eyes meeting in shared terror. It sounded like someone in wet clothes dragging their feet across the wooden planks. Slowly, silently, I got up and crept to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I peered through a gap in the blinds. I couldn't see anything in the thick fog, but I could hear the shuffling sound moving along the deck towards the side of the house where our bedroom window was. Then came a new sound, a soft, wet slap, slap, slap against the wall of the house, followed by a scraping noise against the window screen of our bedroom. My wife let out a small, choked sob. We both knew, with absolute certainty, what was happening. The thing with the long, splayed feet had not returned to the sea that day. It had decided to come up the stairs. It was outside our window, just feet from where our children were sleeping, trying to get a look inside. We didn't wait to see if it would succeed. We quietly herded our sleeping children into the living room, barricaded the bedroom doors with dressers, and sat there in the dark, armed with a fireplace poker and a kitchen knife until the sun came up. The first light revealed an empty deck, but on the window screen of our bedroom there were 3 long, parallel rips and a strange, slimy, saline residue that smelled of low tide and decay. We packed our car in a record time and left that house, never looking back. 2 years ago, my girlfriend Maya and I were broke but desperate for a change of scenery. We found an incredible deal online, a small beach house on the Oregon coast that we could rent for 3 months from December to February for next to nothing. We were artists and craved the solitude and dramatic inspiration of a winter on the ocean. When we arrived, we understood why it was so cheap. The house was at the far end of a lonely spit of land, a few miles from a town that was almost completely shut down for the off-season. The weather was brutal, a constant churning gray sky, relentless wind, and a cold, biting rain. Our house was one of only two on the entire spit. The other one, a larger, more dilapidated house about 100 yards away, was, according to the landlord, empty and had been for years. For the first month, despite the bleakness, it was wonderful. We painted, we wrote, we took long, windswept walks on the deserted beach. We felt like the only two people in the world. But as January set in, our perfect isolation began to feel less like a comfort and more like a threat. It started with a light. One night, I was looking out our kitchen window towards the empty house next door and saw a single faint light flicker on in an upstairs window. It glowed for about a minute, a weak yellow pinprick in the stormy darkness, and then went out. I told Maya, but we dismissed it as a reflection or our minds playing tricks on us. A few days later, I found the first bundle on our porch. It was a small, tightly wound collection of driftwood, seaweed, and seagull feathers, all tied together with a piece of old green fishing line. It was strangely and deliberately constructed. I threw it back onto the beach, assuming it was just some weird flotsam that had washed up. But the next morning, there was another one in the exact same spot. These bundles appeared every few days, a silent, unsettling offering from an unknown source. The feeling of being watched became a constant presence. Sometimes on our walks, we'd see a figure far down the beach, a small, stooped shape huddled against the wind, but they would always disappear among the dunes if we got too close. The light in the empty house appeared more frequently, always in the same window, always just for a minute. The real terror came during a massive winter storm in early February. The wind howled like a banshee, and the waves crashed so high they were eating away at the dunes in front of our house. The single road connecting our spit of land to the mainland was completely flooded. We were trapped. The power went out just after dark, plunging us into a terrifying, roaring blackness. We lit some candles and were huddled by the fireplace when Maya screamed and pointed at the window. I looked out. In a flash of lightning, I saw a figure standing on our porch, its back to the raging sea. It was a small, stooped person wearing a heavy, dark yellow rain slicker, the hood pulled down low, completely obscuring their face. Before we could react, the figure began to move. It shuffled slowly to our front door and started knocking. It wasn't a panicked, seeking shelter kind of knock. It was a slow, patient, methodical tap, tap, tap that was barely audible over the storm. We sat there, frozen in terror. The tapping was relentless. It went on for what felt like an hour. We didn't make a sound. Finally, it stopped. We waited, our ears straining. Then we heard a new sound, a faint scratching at the window. I crept to the window and peered through the corner of the curtain. The figure was there, its hooded face just inches from the glass. It wasn't scratching with its hand. It was holding one of the strange driftwood bundles, and it was slowly, deliberately dragging the sharp end of a stick across the window pane. It was trying to get our attention. As I watched, it slowly lifted its head, and in the darkness of the hood, I saw the glint of two small, dark, unblinking eyes. We spent the rest of the night barricaded in the bathroom, the farthest point from the front of the house. The storm raged, and the methodical scratching on the windows continued until dawn. When the sun came up, the storm had passed, and the figure was gone. We packed our things and left the moment the road was clear, abandoning the last 2 weeks of our lease. We never found out who the winter tenant in the empty house was, but I'm convinced that they weren't looking for shelter. They were looking for company. For my 25th birthday, a group of my friends and I rented a huge, historic beach house in a quaint old whaling town on the coast of Massachusetts. The house was magnificent, but a little spooky. A four-story behemoth from the 1800s, filled with antique furniture and portraits of stern-looking seafaring men. Its most prominent feature was a widow's walk, a railed rooftop platform offering a panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean. When we picked up the keys, the local rental agent, a cheerful woman named Mary, told us a bit about the house's history. This was the home of a Captain Eben Hale, she said. The legend is, his wife, Lydia, would spend every day up on that widow's walk watching for his ship's return. One winter, his ship, the Seraphina, was lost in a terrible storm. They say Lydia never accepted it. She kept watching day and night until she went mad with grief and threw herself into the sea. She laughed. Just a spooky old story, of course. Enjoy your stay. We laughed it off too. The first few nights were a blast, beach parties, bonfires, and exploring the town. But the house had a strange, sorrowful atmosphere that was hard to shake. It always felt cold, even on hot summer days, and there was a faint, persistent smell of salt and damp wool in the upstairs hallways. The strange occurrences began on the fourth night. My friend, Jess, and I were the last ones awake, talking in the living room. Suddenly, we heard a sound from upstairs. It was the sound of a woman softly crying. It was faint, filled with a heartbreaking despair, and it seemed to be coming from the top floor near the staircase that led to the widow's walk. We ran upstairs but found everyone else fast asleep in their rooms. The house was silent again. The next night, it was my turn. I woke up around 3 a.m. feeling inexplicably cold. I looked towards the large window in my bedroom, which faced the ocean, and I saw her. A woman's silhouette was standing on the widow's walk, her figure stark against the moonlit sky. She was completely still, her head turned towards the dark, empty sea. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the door to the rooftop was locked. I had checked it myself before bed. I squeezed my eyes shut, and when I opened them again, she was gone. Panic began to set in among our group. We weren't just imagining things. Doors we had closed would be found open. We'd find small puddles of seawater and wet sandy footprints in the upstairs hallways, even though no one had been to the beach. A beautiful antique compass on the mantelpiece, which had been a gift to the captain, would constantly and inexplicably rearrange itself to point directly east towards the sea. The final night was the most terrifying. A thick, disorienting fog rolled in from the ocean, completely enveloping the house. We all decided to stay together in the living room, too scared to sleep alone in our rooms. We put on a movie, trying to distract ourselves, but the feeling of a sad, desperate presence was overwhelming. Around 2 a.m., the crying started again. This time, it wasn't faint. It was loud, right outside the living room door, in the main hallway. It was the sound of a woman wailing in pure, soul-shattering agony. We all sat frozen, huddled together on the couch. The crying was soon joined by a new sound, a frantic, desperate scratching on the other side of the door. My friend Liam, the bravest among us, crept to the door and looked through the old-fashioned keyhole. He stumbled back, his face white as a sheet, his eyes wide with horror. "What is it?" we all whispered. "It's a woman," he stammered, his voice trembling. "She's on her knees, she's scratching at the door, and her clothes, they're soaking wet, and they're covered in seaweed." The doorknob began to rattle violently. We screamed and shoved a heavy bookshelf in front of the door. We spent the rest of the night listening to the wailing and the desperate splintering scratches of the grieving woman who had come back from the sea, trying to get into the room with us. The sounds only faded with the first light of dawn. We were out of that house an hour later. It wasn't a malicious haunting. It was a haunting of profound endless sorrow. But the grief of Lydia Hale was so powerful, so absolute, that it had tainted the very walls of her home, and it was trying to pull us into the darkness with her.